I didn't care more than words can say. If I didn't care, would I feel the
There was word going around down the streets of Vienna that there was somebody coming to Austria who wants to save 50 children.
And what makes my head go round?
I had never seen red polish. I just looked at them and thought how wonderful.
What on earth would go through my grandparents' mind to leave 2 children behind, leave the safety of their home, and go into Nazi Germany?
I think about it a lot. I think they were just plain decent people.
If I didn't care for
It all started in an innocent way. My husband Gil came home very close to dinner time and asked what our plans were for the evening. "There's something I want to talk to you about," he said. "So come into the bathroom while I shave." I sat down and listened. Gil told me that his friend Louis Levine had come to see him that day at Gil's law office. They had talked for hours about an idea to bring Jewish children out of Nazi Germany and into the United States. "This is really crazy," I told Gil. "No one in his right mind would go into Germany now. It's not safe, especially for Jews. I'm not sure you could get in, and I doubt you could stand it for even 24 hours. I'd be too scared to put a foot into that country, assuming the stormtroopers would even let me in." The newspapers had been filled with stories about the sickening atrocities in Nazi Germany. Articles about concentration camps, the humiliation of the Jews, and all of the brutality continued to shock us each day.
By early 1939, the Nazis' noose was rapidly tightening around Jews living in Germany and Austria. The United States government was largely indifferent to the situation, and American citizens found it nearly impossible to bring refugees, even children, into this country. But Gilbert Kraus, a 42-year-old business lawyer, was determined to try. He had been raised in a secular Jewish family and was not religious himself. In fact, he and his wife Eleanor sent their 2 children to a Quaker school in Philadelphia.
I don't think we'll ever know why my grandparents did what they did. My grandfather was certainly reading about what was going on in Europe and what wasn't going on in the United States when it came to saving lives. He was a very contrary man, and I think he just was going to go do something that he knew was important and right. My grandmother, she's more of a mystery. She was a great beauty, which she reminded everybody of frequently. And she did what women in the 20s and the 30s did. She created homes, she created environments, she had people to dinner, she changed the slip covers in the spring and took them off in the fall. Why she would do this, that's more of a mystery.
The number of times that Gilbert Kraus and Eleanor Kraus were told, no, back off, don't do this. It won't be good for us. It will set off a reaction that we won't be able to control. Number of times they were told that, both from official quarters and private quarters, and from some quarters within the Jewish community. But I think they understood in a very clear way that this was a matter of life and death, and indeed it turned out to be a matter of life and death.
I had an extremely happy childhood. In the summertime, my parents rented 2 rooms in the second floor of a farmhouse in a little village called Piesting, about 25 kilometers from Vienna. We spent the summer going barefoot and playing with the farm kids. In the wintertime, of course, we went to school. I went to a grammar school called the Schubert Schule because it was the grammar school where Schubert had taught as a teacher.
I was born in Vienna in 1928. My father was a lawyer. We would go to the Vienna woods every Sunday, and it was my job to make sure we got home at 12. Mother came if we were going with friends, but not if it was just Daddy and me, then it was just Daddy and me. And we spoke in whispers in the woods. And Vienna was very beautiful, really beautiful.
My father and 2 other relatives were in the plywood business, Sperrholz business. My uncle, who was the actual owner of the business, he was the primary person. They had 2 stores and they had quite a bit of plywood, and it supported 3 families rather well.
After Hitler was voted in by the people in Germany, my father said, well, it can't last and it won't happen here. These people are too intelligent and we're so advanced to know that somebody's going to get hurt, but let's hope, you know, it isn't too many people.
Gil was determined to find some legal way to bring children into the United States. We had been married for 15 years, and I knew all about his abilities as a lawyer. But I told myself this notion of going to Germany was out. No one, not even Gil, could consider this a practical idea.
The first obstacle was simply dealing with the situation at home and figuring out how to navigate a social setting in which the immigration of large numbers of Jews was not going to be popular.
President Roosevelt was a hero to the Jews of his day. When Jews looked around the world and they saw Hitler and they saw Stalin and they saw Mussolini, they felt mighty glad that the man who was running the United States was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Nevertheless, he was a consummate politician, and there were things that he felt deeply about, and he made sure they happened. Arming America secretly was one of them. Helping Britain was one of them. Saving Jews was not one of them.
Gilbert set up a meeting with George Messersmith at the State Department in Washington. A former U.S. ambassador in Vienna, Messersmith was now serving as Undersecretary of State. During the meeting, Gilbert mentioned that he was a member of B'rith Shalom, a Jewish fraternal organization based in Philadelphia. The group had recently built a summer camp outside the city, and the camp had an extra dormitory with enough beds for 50 children.
Gil told Mr. Messersmith that he and I were prepared to go to Germany ourselves to select the children and bring them back. Gil also asked a lot of questions. Would parents give up their children? Were conditions as extreme as the newspapers said? And why weren't children already coming into this country?
Messersmith was sympathetic but not very encouraging. He reminded Gilbert that America had rigid immigration quotas for every foreign country. The number of people in Germany and Austria who had already applied for visas would fill the quota for the next 5 years. As conditions got worse for Jews, 10,000 Jewish children trapped inside Nazi Germany found safe haven in England. They had been sent away by their parents on trains and boats known as Kindertransports. But in America, the doors remained all but closed.
Congress was in no particular mood to be generous in terms of refugees seeking to come to America. Evidence, of course, is the Wagner-Rogers Bill. This was an effort to bring in children. The assumption was, who would stand in the way of poor refugee children? That will be something that will tug at everybody's heartstrings. But as it turned out, that didn't happen.
After months of debate in Congress, President Roosevelt declined to support the proposal to rescue children. The bill died without ever coming to a vote.
After Hitler invaded, the sign came up that said Jews over here and non-Jews over here. And I asked my dad, actually, what did I do? And he said, you didn't do anything. You were just born Jewish, and that's the way it is right now.
Even at this late date in early '39, this was still a moment when Nazi policy was ambivalent about the emigration of Jews. The door was closing, and closing very fast, because getting rid of Jews was the goal.
Gil had reviewed the quota figures for Germany and Austria and compared them with the number of people who came to America. He discovered the two lists did not match up. The quotas were always higher than the actual number of people who entered the United States. Gil did not understand this discrepancy, especially when thousands of people were trying to come here. Why wasn't the quota filled?
Gilbert discovered several reasons for the unused visas. Some Jewish families had already left for places like Cuba or Shanghai. A few had found their way into Palestine. Others were too sick or no longer had enough money to come to America by the time their visas came through.
That's when Gil had an idea, a glimmer of hope. He wondered if there might be a way to set aside some of these unused visas for children who would be all ready to leave for the United States. Mr. Messersmith was diplomatic. He told Gil it was an intriguing idea that was worth considering. He did not say yes, but he also did not say no.
Eleanor went right to work, asking for affidavits from everyone she knew who might be willing to sponsor a refugee child.
For the next several weeks, that was all I did, going from home to home and office to office. I had to ask our close friends and casual acquaintances the most embarrassing financial questions.
Roughly 95% of Americans did not want immigration quotas tampered with. Even 25% of American Jews didn't want to raise this issue. They were worried in an era of great anti-Semitism that any effort to change the quotas would be interpreted as un-American.
We are Christian insofar as we believe in Christ's principle of love your neighbor as yourself. And with that principle, I challenge every Jew in this nation to tell me that he does not believe in it.
Gil told me that several visitors had come to his office while he was away in Washington. A few days later, 3 of the most important Jews in Philadelphia urged him to drop his rescue idea at once. If he were to continue, they would take all necessary steps to prevent it.
There were more than 100 organizations in the United States that promoted openly anti-Semitism, not covertly. Radio programs from Father Coughlin deriding Jews. There were anti-Jewish demonstrations. Under those circumstances, many American Jews said, don't rock the boat. It's tough enough as it is.
More Jewish leaders came to see Gil. The message was the same as before. He must scrap this rescue idea at once. Surely he would not subject his wife to the dangers of going ahead with it, or the embarrassment if it failed.
And you would think that he would have listened to them as a Jew, but if anything, this probably put a little steel in his back, because when he had a sense of what was right, he was going to pursue it no matter what anyone else thought of him. And this was right.
After 2 weeks, I had started about 25 affidavits, but had not yet completed any of them. I felt I should be going much faster. Every night, Gil would come home with names of more people who said they would be willing to sponsor the children. But eventually, I began to feel as if I were accomplishing something after all with my maze of papers. It took 6 weeks, but I had completed 54 affidavits, 4 extra just in case something went wrong. It wasn't easy, it wasn't pleasant, but it was accomplished.
When Hitler came into Austria and he was greeted with open arms and they were marching down the streets, the next thing we knew was that they decided to hang the flag with the Hakenkreuz, the swastika, all the way down from the roof of the apartment building right across our balcony, which meant that we could peek out on either side of it, and that was it. Then we were told that if there was any dirt on that flag or any damage to it, we would be killed. We were threatened with our lives, so we prayed every day that the birds wouldn't fly by and drop anything on the flag.
I went to the classroom about 3 weeks after the Anschluss, and a yellow line was painted in front of the last row of seats in my classroom. And the teacher announced with a very serious face, not a cheerful face, he says, "The authorities have ordered that we rearrange the seating in the room." And he called out the names of all the Jewish kids, boys, and we had to go sit behind this line, and the other boys sat in front. And that was the beginning of things getting rather unpleasant.
My sister was in grade school, and I was enrolled into kindergarten. I thought that was great, all the little children around. I needed to go to the bathroom, and I raised my hand. It was obvious what I wanted, but nobody asked me. I mean, the teacher didn't say, "What do you want?" or something. I was just ignored and ignored and ignored until finally what happens to a child is they wet their pants. And that's what happened to me. And the teacher came over, grabbed me by the crunch of the whatever I was wearing, held me up and said, but in German, "You see, this is what the Juden do. They make in their pants." And then she shoved me down. And after that horrendous experience, I went home and I was crying, and my mother didn't send me back, which was just as well, because very shortly thereafter, it was announced that I could not come back.
In Germany, Hitler's anti-Jewish policies had worsened gradually. But in Austria, the Nazis imposed brutal measures immediately after the Anschluss, Germany's unopposed annexation. Adolf Eichmann, a young SS officer, had been sent to Vienna with orders to carry out the Nazi policy of Judenrein, the removal of every Jew who lived there.
Nobody, no Jew or non-Jew in Germany or in Austria or in any other country could imagine that the Nazis were going to kill the Jews. Even for anti-Semites, anti-Semites might want to beat up Jews. They might want to, in fact, pass discriminatory legislation against Jews. They might want Jews to leave, go someplace else. They might want all sorts of things. But to kill them outright, that was not even conceivable. That people were so incredibly supportive of Hitler probably was a real shock.
Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Over the course of 2 terrifying days in November 1938, synagogues were burned to the ground throughout Germany and Austria. Jewish businesses were looted and destroyed. Men were beaten in their homes and on the streets. In the weeks that followed, thousands of Jewish men were rounded up and sent off to concentration camps.
What I remember at home was constant consultations, friends, family, every day, every evening, every afternoon, all the time was spent, where are we going, how are we getting out?
I remember all of a sudden having people at home all day long because they didn't have their businesses any longer. And you hear conversations about trying to get visas and trying to find ways out. And in most cases, if you don't have somebody to sponsor you in the United States, you're not going to get a visa. And the very grim thoughts of, if you're not going to get one, are you going to be one of those that's not going to survive?
In Vienna, it wasn't the case that some people were wondering whether or not to leave. Whoever could leave did. My pediatrician left by jumping out the window and killing himself. What people don't understand is at the beginning, you could get out. Everybody could get out. Nobody would let us in. Everyone could have been saved. Everyone.
Gil and I could not remain in Philadelphia and know if our rescue plan would work. The only thing we could do was go to Germany and find out if there was even a chance of bringing children back. If not, we would return at once, and that would be the end of it.
As the Krauses prepared to leave for Europe, a new problem arose. War was increasingly imminent. Although it was still legal for Americans to travel to Nazi Germany, an assistant at the State Department pleaded with Eleanor to stay home. "It is much too dangerous for a woman," he told her.
We were so shaken by this unexpected turn of events. Gil said it would be impossible for him to go alone. There would be too much work for one person. On the train back to Philadelphia, I had a brainstorm. Robert Schless was our children's pediatrician, and we had known him for years. He was charming and intelligent, and he spoke fluent German. Gil and I went to see him the next day.
He was sort of adventurous. He joined the British Army during the war, the First World War. He was one of the first flight surgeons in the Navy. Dad was the type who would jump at a challenge like that. And also, the one thing that the State Department demanded was that these children be examined because for health reasons. And so Dad was a sort of logical choice.
Dr. Schless was a widower with 3 boys at home, but he immediately agreed to help with the rescue plan and go with Gilbert.
They're leaving tomorrow, my father told me. And I went down to the boat, watched them go and all that. I was 13. I had no idea then what the situation was like. Except that it was dangerous.
Five days after he left, Gil sent a cable saying that he had arrived safely in England. The next one came from Berlin. Gil told me he was going directly to Vienna. The situation there was quickly getting worse for Jews, and that is where he would find the children. A few days later, our maid said that Gil had telephoned from Vienna and that he would call back in a couple of hours. I was sure he was in trouble. I wondered if he had been arrested. The call came through, and there was much excitement. Our children were on the extensions, and all of us kept talking to Gil at once. Then Gil said to me, "I have to talk to you."
Gilbert told his wife he had too much to do and not enough time. Despite the earlier warning from the State Department, Gilbert urged Eleanor to come and help him. A ship was sailing from New York in a few days, and Gilbert wanted Eleanor to be on that ship.
In 1939, they had a 9-year-old at home and a 13-year-old at home. And going to the heart of Nazi Germany and Austria may not be a wise move for parents with 2 young children. They had to make the decision that they were going to do something terribly dangerous, maybe risking leaving their children behind as orphans if something went wrong.
I told the children I was going to Europe to join their father. I explained that he had a lot of work to do and that I needed to help him. Gil and I had never been away from the children at the same time. I wasn't the least bit happy about leaving them. After arriving in Europe, I took a train from Le Havre to Paris. I was bursting with excitement at the thought of meeting Gil there. The very second I got off the train, I saw him waiting for me. He looked so debonair, and he presented me with a bouquet of violets. Gil and I saw as much of Paris as we could in one afternoon. We shopped and we stared into each and every store window. We had drinks at a charming outdoor cafe. We did not have much time, and we made the most of it. It was a wonderful afternoon.
Early that evening, Gilbert and Eleanor boarded the Orient Express for the overnight trip to Vienna. Along the way, Gilbert prepared his wife for the conditions that were waiting for them inside Nazi Germany.
On the train from Paris to Vienna, we stopped briefly at Linz. We decided to stretch our legs and walked out onto the platform. The loudspeakers were blaring. Hitler was making a speech. He screamed every word. This was Hitler's birthplace, and my introduction to Nazi Germany. After Gil and I arrived in Vienna, everyone pointed things out to me as we drove in a taxi from the station. We went past the hotel that served as Nazi headquarters. Driving along the Ring Road, we passed the famous Opera House. Our hotel, the Bristol, was just across the street. Bob Schless was waiting for us at the hotel. He introduced me to Hetty Neufeld, a young woman from Vienna who greeted me with flowers. She had beautiful red hair, deep brown eyes, and a face full of freckles. I liked her immediately. Hetty was half Jewish and had gladly agreed to help us with our work.
Gilbert warned his wife that their hotel rooms were searched every day. The secret police knew their every move, where they went, what they were doing.
We went downstairs to have dinner in the hotel dining room. As we waited for our table, I noticed a painted sign on the door. Juden verboten. A large oil painting of Hitler dominated the room. 2 stormtroopers walked in and stared at us. The sight of them made me feel so uncomfortable. After that, I had no appetite.
As the Nazis stepped up their campaign to drive Jews out of Austria, Jewish leaders in Vienna were forced to cooperate. The Jewish community had already collected files on thousands of families increasingly desperate to leave. The Nazis had confiscated all of these files and now had complete access to them. But so did the Krauses.
In the morning, we made our way through the crowded streets and arrived at a large, shabby building that served as the headquarters for Vienna's Jewish community. The parents and children hoping to be chosen were already there waiting for us. Hundreds of them had shown up. We told the parents there might be a transport of children to America. Of course, we did not yet know for sure. We asked each child, "Would you like to go to America? Would you be willing to leave your mother and father? Would you come with us and wait for them there?"
I said, "Can I take my little sister with me?" My parents were horrified to hear me say that because they were afraid that that would scotch the whole thing. But whoever was talking to me said, "No, we're not taking any babies." "Oh, but I can take complete care of her and she's almost out of diapers," you know, that. But no.
My mother was very unexcited about having me go alone without her supervision to an odd place like America where children are kidnapped. But my father was more practical. He was very sure that there was no way to stay and no minute to spare.
My father read in the newspaper that there were people who were coming from the United States to rescue 50 children. I was just getting over the measles. And my mother said, so my father said to her, "I think you should have her go and see if she could be one of the 50. And my mother said, "No, she's still ill from the measles, and I can't let her go." And my father said, "Yes, you are, because we may die here." This was already a time when this was sort of imminent. "We'll die here, but she's not going to die. She's going to go and lead a life in America."
To take a child from its mother seemed to be the lowest thing a human being could do. Yet it was as if we had drawn up in a lifeboat in a most turbulent sea. Every parent we met seemed to say, "Here, yes, freely, gladly, take my child to a safer shore."
I vaguely remember a long line of people, parents and children, waiting to get in. And eventually our turn came, we came in. I went in to see Dr. Schless, and he gave me a physical examination, as I recall. And he also showed me some weird blotches on paper, which in retrospect, 50 years later, I realized were probably a Rorschach test. But he said, was ist, and was ist das, and was ist das. And I said, gee, this is kind of stupid, you know, it looks like a butterfly, or I don't know, maybe a beetle or a bug or a star.
The goal was to pick those children who were healthiest in mind and body, those who were least injured by their past humiliating experiences, children who would be able to stand the trip and the separation from their parents. Social and financial backgrounds were to be ignored entirely.
After a few weeks in Vienna, the list of 50 children was nearly complete.
I was leaving my parents and my sister in danger of their lives, and I was saving my own skin. I was just deeply ashamed of that.
All of the parents had to sign papers turning their children over to us. They were very brave. But the fathers were dejected. They looked so lifeless and hopeless. The mothers were more aggressive, more hopeful. They smiled, they chattered, their cheeks were flushed and their eyes were dancing. They were protecting their children.
New complications arose. Eleanor was told there were problems with the affidavits that she had carefully prepared. Gilbert discovered the American consulate in Vienna did not know about the plan to save unused visas for the children.
Things looked so bad for us now. To make matters worse, we were also told by one of the consulate officials there would be no new visas in Vienna until July.
The last hope for the Krauses rested with Raymond Geist, the senior diplomatic officer at the American Embassy in Berlin.
Gil and I left immediately for Berlin, taking a train that same night. We arrived early the next morning, but it was Sunday, and the embassy was closed. We would have to wait another day to see Mr. Geist. I had never been to Berlin before. The streets were crowded. The stormtroopers were everywhere. We passed the beautiful Adlon Hotel and walked underneath the Brandenburg Gate. Gil showed me the American Embassy, which was very close by. I peered at the faces of the people on the streets. Here was the superior race. We were both anxious about what the next day would bring. Gil was especially worried about our meeting with Mr. Geist. He was a busy man with so much to do. We were not even sure he would have the time to listen to us.
The next morning, Geist had encouraging news. Eleanor's affidavits were in perfect shape. Geist told the Krauses he would try to set aside visas for the 50 children from Vienna. But he made no guarantees.
At that time, it wasn't at all clear that there was going to be a mass extermination. This was long before the actual murder started. So there was that constant idea that, well, sooner or later, eventually, either perhaps maybe the children would go back, or perhaps the parents would come to the States. And on the basis of that, promises were made by Mr. Kraus to the parents that they would be taken care of no matter what. And subsequently, I found out that he personally signed affidavits guaranteeing that he would be responsible for it.
One final step was needed before the children would be allowed to leave Vienna. Each child had to be issued a German passport by the Nazi authorities.
Hedy Neufeld introduced us to Richard Friedman. He was a young Jewish man from Vienna who helped to obtain passports for thousands of Jews who were trying to leave. He met us in front of the Rothschild Palace. This gorgeous building had been confiscated by the Nazis and turned into Vienna's central office for Jewish immigration. Richard brought us upstairs to see the Gestapo officer in charge. Stormtroopers were standing at attention at every doorway. The officer was seated behind an immense desk. "Who are these two?" the officer asked Richard, speaking in German. "These are two Americans, Mr. and Mrs. Kraus from Philadelphia in the United States." "Are they Jews?" the officer demanded to know. "Yes," said Richard, "they are American Jews." "Ask them why they are here," said the officer. Gil answered in English, "We have come to take 50 Jewish children with us to America."
They understood that the door was closing. They seemed to have understood in a very concrete way, maybe the way a lawyer's mind sees things, that when that door closed, the fate of those Jewish communities was sealed.
The Gestapo officer asked Richard several more questions. Finally, he announced, "There is no objection. This couple may take the children with them. The passports will be issued."
It just didn't sink in that we were going to be separated from our parents and sent away. And they said, well, we'll come later, but not now. That was terrible, to think of a little girl thinking they were going to be separated from their mother and father.
It was only a few days before the Krauses and the 50 children were scheduled to leave Vienna. One of the children, 5-year-old Heinrich Steinberger, had fallen ill. The Krauses knew they could not risk traveling with a sick child. Heinrich was taken off the list.
The next day, we were flooded with letters, visits to our hotel, and telephone calls from parents of children who were not selected. We could not blame these parents for their persistence. They begged us, but they were also so polite.
The Krauses picked 14-year-old Alfred Berg. He was older than all of the others, but his younger sister Charlotte had already been chosen. He was a logical replacement for the sick child.
The train from Vienna was not scheduled to leave until 8:30 in the evening, but all of the parents and children were in the waiting room 2 hours earlier.
It was the first time in my life I ever rode in a car, because my parents engaged a taxi to bring us there, because we didn't want to be, I think in retrospect, they didn't want to be seen walking the streets with suitcases. It wasn't safe.
It was raining. It was a very rainy night and very dark, and we were taken to the Bahnhof, and the train was there, and the soldiers were there, SS, brown shirts, black shirts, brown boots, black boots, and the German Shepherds and Dobermans and the Rottweilers.
The train station is full of stormtroopers. And our first recollection was, well, they changed their mind, they're not going to let us go.
My mother used to make wonderful roast chicken, and I wanted to have some of her roast chicken, which she packed in a little sort of a lunchbox type affair. And never, I mean, I don't know where they got the money for it, but they managed. I had my teddy bear in my arm, and that's all I was allowed to bring.
Hedy Neufeld went to every parent and told them that they must not wave goodbye to the children when the train pulled away. Jews were not permitted to give the Nazi salute, and if the parents raised their arms to wave, they would be arrested. The parents stood in orderly and quiet fashion. They stared at the faces of their children. Their mouths were smiling, but their eyes were red and strained. No one waved. It was the most heartbreaking show of dignity and bravery I had ever witnessed.
My mother said to me, "You be a good girl and listen to your foster parents and make sure you get a good education, and before you know it, we'll be there and we'll all be reunited, and I'll see you in America." I remember the darkness, and I never saw her again.
As the train made its way to Berlin, I prayed that God might comfort all those parents who had returned home to the sight of an empty bed. I asked Gil, "What will we do if we get to Berlin with the children and find out that we do not have any visas for them?" I could not imagine having to bring any of them back to Vienna.
On the morning when the Krauses and children arrived, Berlin was in a festive mood. The city was celebrating a military alliance between Germany and Italy known as the Pact of Steel. Later that day, the alliance would be ratified in an elaborate ceremony led by von Ribbentrop, the German foreign minister, and Count Ciano, Mussolini's son-in-law and Italy's foreign minister.
We did not know that the celebration was taking place at the Adlon Hotel, where Gil and I were staying. As the taxi driver tried to make his way to the hotel, we saw enormous crowds of people blocking the entire street. My knees were trembling as I made my way to the front desk. Without quite looking up, I could see dozens of men in German and Italian uniforms. Von Ribbentrop and Count Ciano were talking to each other at the foot of the stairs. I walked over to the little birdcage elevator and waited for it to take me up to our room. I looked up very quietly. It was Ribbentrop and Ciano. I was shaking from head to foot. Gil had remained with the children and taken them to Berlin's official Jewish center, which was still operating with the Nazis' permission. Gil had made arrangements for the children to stay there while we waited to hear about the visas.
Mr. Kraus was talking to an SS officer in his black uniform, loaded down with his pistol and his authority. And Mr. Kraus was yelling at him in English. I said, geez, he shouldn't yell at that. That's dangerous. You know, if in Vienna, when we were on the street, if you saw an SS man come and you made sure you got way out of the way and made believe you were invisible. And here was Mr. Kraus yelling at this officer, and the officer was talking back in German. And to this day, I have no idea what it was all about. Some permit or something of that sort that had to be signed. But I was really frightened. That's because I thought that Mr. Kraus is going to get shot.
In the morning, Gil brought the children to the American embassy. Each of them had to be interviewed and examined. I arrived a short time later and waited in the hallway with some of the children. They looked so tired, and I did my best to comfort them and cheer them up. Finally, I saw Gil. "What about the visas?" I asked him. He leaned over and whispered, "They have 50 visas waiting for us. Our worries are over."
We stayed overnight in Berlin, and there was a young man who played the banjo and taught us songs. He taught us Hine Lola Yanum, do you know that? It's just very simple. It basically means that the protector of Israel does not sleep.
One of the younger girls came in for her interview. She sat in a big chair across from the embassy officer. We put a pen in her hand and asked her to write her name. As she grabbed the pen, she began to sob hysterically. "Muss ich Sarah schreiben?" she said, forcing out the words over her tears. For a few seconds, we were too stunned to answer her question. One of Hitler's decrees required Jewish girls to use Sarah as their middle name. Jewish boys were forced to use the name Israel. As the sobbing little girl sat there with the pen in her hand, she was asking, "Must I write Sarah?" The embassy official lowered his head into his hands. Then he looked up at her and said, "You can use your own name where you are going. You will never have to use Sarah again."
Hine lo yanum, hine lo yishan, hine lo yanum, hine lo yishan, hine lo yanum velo yishan, shomer, shomer Yisrael.
It was an awesome sight to see this large ship, which is going to take us to America with the American flag flying. It was something to be remembered.
During the 10-day voyage across the ocean, the Krauses and Dr. Schless watched over the children and began preparing them for their new lives in America. The ship arrived in New York Harbor on the morning of June 3rd, 1939.
As we prepared to leave the ship, I could see one of our friends waiting for us on the dock. He held up a small girl wearing a printed dress. It was my daughter, Ellen. A boy kept bouncing up and down next to them, and I knew that must be my son, Stephen. Finally, I was able to make out their faces. I could not believe I was home.
save one life, the Jewish sages would say, you've saved the world. Here they saved 50 children and their families, and the generations that will follow from those families.
Paint my grandparents as saints. They went to Nazi Germany and Austria, but they stayed in luxury hotels and they ate in fine restaurants. I honestly think it wouldn't have occurred to them to do it any other way. What they did was very selfless, even if my grandmother did it with a really nice hat.